My name is Doug Sassaman. I'm in Dr. Kovar and Dr. Beeman's group. This is actually my last semester. I should be finishing up next week, hopefully. So I'm going to give a quick overview, brief overview on our work on laser sintering of ceramics. So the punchline basically to my talk is that laser sintering of ceramics is really difficult, and it doesn't play well because the ceramics are brittle and sensitive to thermal shock. So you kind of need to engineer some ways around that. And we have two ways that we work on primarily. The first one is indirect selective laser sintering, where we add a sacrificial binder so that when we melt it, when we scan it with the laser, only the sacrificial binder melts and kind of forms bridges between the ceramic particles. But this method does require some post-processing, but we do have the ability to tune the porosity, and I'll talk a little bit about that next. The second method to overcome the difficulties with ceramics is by reducing the kinematics of sintering, the kinetics of sintering. And the way we do that is by a process called selective laser flash sintering, which is very similar to SLS, except that we add an electric field across the powder bed. This method doesn't require any binder or post-processing, and it is targeted towards high-density, defect-free parts. So I'll start with indirect selective laser sintering, and I'm just going to give a highlight of a new capability in our lab, which is an Insitu Microscope for the SLS process. So we went into this work with ceramics thinking that the mixed powder, again, it's mixed ceramic and polymer, that powder behaved very similarly to nylon during the laser sintering process. So we designed this instrument and we actually proved ourselves wrong. So the video in the top is scanning the mixed powder, nylon and alumina, at about 1,000 millimeters a second. And the white circle, which is kind of faint on the screen, represents where the laser is at all times. The bottom video is just plain nylon. So you can see in the top video, not much is actually happening. In the bottom video, after the laser passes, the particles become translucent, which is indicative of melting, and then they start to coalesce. So this led us to a new understanding that the powders behave differently during laser sintering. We actually developed a model to describe that. So just real quick, in terms of the capabilities of the device, it can span the time and length scales of the SLS process, so for example, you need to capture the particle scale dynamics, which are very fast, very small. You also need to capture the powder bed dynamics, which are a little bit larger and a little bit slower. So this instrument, you can adjust those two parameters. It can also operate under realistic manufacturing conditions. So it can operate in a heated chamber. You can image multiple layers because it clears the powder deposition system. And all of the adjustments are external, so the machine can stay sealed the entire time. As I mentioned, with the indirect SLS process, we're sort of able to tune the porosity. And porosity can be beneficial for some applications, especially on the surface. And an example application would be like catalysis, where you want the surface of the solid to interact with some liquid or gas. So in the indirect SLS process, we're able to tune that small scale porosity on the surface, which I'm showing with the X-ray computed tomography images. You can see there's some porosity down at the particle scale on the order of microns. And then with this indirect SLS process, we can build pretty complex 3D parts. And I'm showing the CAD file corresponding to the parts that I'm showing there. Those are green parts, so they still have polymer in them, but we have successfully burned out the polymer and densified the ceramic with that shape. So the second method that I mentioned to get over the limitations with ceramics is by this process we call selective laser flash sintering. And mechanically, this process behaves or is very similar to the SLS process. So all the mechanical components are the same, except for the fact that we add an electric field across the powder bed. So you can see that there's a power supply attached to a positive electrode, and then we measure the current at the negative electrode. I'll give a more detailed view here. So the image on the top is a top-down view of the powder bed. The gray regions are the electrodes, the white region is the loose powder, and the laser is indicated by the orange arrow. So the laser starts scanning in the positive electrode, and you can see from I'll explain this actually. The plot below is the current through the part or powder bed as a function of time. So you can see as the laser starts scanning on the positive electrode, there's no current flowing, and it continues on into the powder bed. There's still no current flowing until just before it reaches the negative electrode. And then you see this sharp spike in current. And this is kind of the hallmark of successful laser flash sintering. Basically what's happening is the laser is kind of heating the ceramic powder, increasing the electrical conductivity, and then you get current flowing. This is analogous or an adaptation to the flash sintering process in traditional ceramics. So this slide just highlights the capabilities of this process. We are able to produce multi-layer parts. This one is a 35-layer part. And we can also, we can make pretty dense parts. I think these are on the order of 90% local density, but there's still some challenges to work out. The bottom SEM images shows that there's some cracking still, which we're working on now. And that's it. Thank you, guys. If you have any questions, I'll have a poster on the indirect selective laser sintering stuff later. And I think Dr. Kovar will be around to answer any questions about the flash sintering process.